Some stories shout to be heard, but the best ones arrive in the quiet. Welcome to Tales from Timber Creek, where every lantern glow, every mountain trail, and even the falling rain has a gentle story to tell. So pull up a chair, sit back, relax. I have a story to tell you. The Gray Ghost of Millbrook Hollow. There's a kind of man who cannot rest until the world matches the story he has already told himself about it. Ezra Talbot was that kind of man, and this is the account of what his certainty cost the town of Millbrook Hollow and what it very nearly cost him. The winter Ezra Talbot turned 41, something began killing livestock along the eastern draws below Widow's Ridge. It started small. A lamb dragged from the Pruitt pen, nothing left but a smear of blood in the frost and a trail of scattered wool. Then a yearling calf from the Osgood herd, throat opened clean, carcass barely touched, as if the killing itself had been the point, and the eating an afterthought. Then 2 hens from the parsonage coop, though hens were beneath the dignity of whatever had taken the calf, and folks began to wonder if there wasn't more than one thing moving through the dark. Millbrook Hollow was a town of perhaps 300 souls, tucked into a fold of the foothills where 2 creeks married into one, a day and a half's ride from the nearest railhead. It was the kind of place that had scraped its living from thin soil and even thinner luck for 2 generations, and it did not have losses to spare. When the widow Calloway's milk cow was found gutted in the March mud, the town council did what frightened people have always done. It turned to the man who claimed to already understand the shape of the danger. Ezra Talbot understood wolves, or believed he did, which in his mind amounted to the same thing. He had been a young man of 23, greener than spring wheat when he'd ridden with old Cassius Reed on the last great wolf hunt the territory had seen. The hunt for the wolf men had come to call the Gray Ghost of Widow's Ridge. A stock killer, so cunning it had eluded traps, poison, and rifle for 3 winters before old Cassius finally put a ball through its shoulder in a blizzard nobody else would have hunted in. Cassius had died the following spring, of a lung fever some said he'd caught in that same blizzard, and with him had died the only other man alive who'd seen the ghost with his own 2 eyes. But Ezra had seen it too, just once, at about 40 yards, through sleet so thick it turned the whole world to static. A gray shape, too big for an ordinary wolf, moving low and unhurried through timber, gone before he could raise his rifle. He had carried that half-second his whole life, the way other men carry a wound. It had made him, in the town's eyes and eventually in his own, the resident authority on all matters of predator and track. He'd hunted mountain lion and bear both, competently enough, but it was the wolf, the idea of the wolf, the old unfinished business of it, that lived under his skin like a splinter gone to infection. So when the council came to him in March with the news of the widow Calloway's cow, Ezra Talbot did not ask many questions. He rode out to the carcass, knelt in the churned mud, and felt something in his chest go tight and almost glad. God forgive him, because he had been waiting 20 years for this. It's come back, he told the council that evening, before he had tracked a single print more than 30 yards. The gray ghost's gotten old and hungry, or it's thrown a pup with the same nature. Either way, it's found its way back to the hollow, and I mean to finish what Cassius started. Nobody in that room thought to ask how he could be so certain from one dead cow. They wanted an enemy with a name, and Ezra had given him one. Ezra's hound, a big raw-boned blue tick named Judge, had a fault that Ezra had never quite trained out of him. The dog would occasionally tree the wrong thing entirely, baying with total conviction at a hollow trunk that held nothing more dangerous than a possum, while whatever had actually crossed the trail slipped away through the brush behind them both. Ezra used to laugh about it around the stove at Pruitt's store. Old Judge, he'd say, will bark the bark of absolute certainty at a coon and let a cougar walk right past his back legs. It did not occur to him that spring that a man could have the same fault as a dog. He took Judge and rode the eastern draws for the better part of 2 weeks, and found sign of a kind. Print here, half filled with melt water and blown wide by a thaw until it might have been anything. A tuft of gray-brown fur snagged on a fence post that might have come from a wolf or a coyote or a dog that has gone wild, or nothing living at all. Scat that Ezra examined with the solemnity of a physician reading an x-ray, though scat, as any honest hunter will tell you, rarely confesses much beyond a general appetite. He read into every ambiguous mark the shape he had already decided was there. This was not, in his mind, a failure of evidence. It was confirmation. The ghost, after all, was famous for leaving little behind. He found what he called a den, a rock overhang above Widow's Ridge with old bones scattered before it. Bones so weathered and sun-bleached they might have lain there since Cassius's day. He staked it out for 3 nights running, froze half through, and saw nothing but a barn owl and his own breath. He came back to town gaunt and unshaven and told the council the ghost had grown too clever to be caught denned, that they would need to hunt it moving on the game trails at dusk. And here was the trouble. The killings didn't stop. In fact, they crept closer to town even as Ezra rode farther from it, chasing his old ghost through the high draws where he had first glimpsed something gray and half imagined 20 years before. A dog went missing from behind the livery. Then, worse, chickens and a piglet from the Ferris place, which stood not in the wild eastern hills at all, but at the very edge of Millbrook's own main street, close enough that Sarah Ferris said she'd heard something moving in her yard the same night, low and quick, and wrong somehow, though she could not say what she meant by wrong. That's not the ghost country, someone said at Pruitt's store a little uneasily. The ghost keeps to the high ground, always has. Then it's changed its habits, Ezra said, same as any creature grown desperate with age, and he rode east again the next morning, deeper into the hills, more certain than ever that the answer lay wherever his memory told him a great wolf ought to be, rather than wherever the fresh kills actually were. There was a girl in Millbrook Hollow named Ruth Calloway, the widow Calloway's granddaughter, 13 years old and quieter than most children her age, who spent her afternoons roaming the creek bottoms behind her grandmother's place with a slingshot and a keen, unhurried pair of eyes. Ruth had not been raised on legends of the Great Ghost. She had been raised instead by a grandfather who trapped fur for a living before consumption took him, and who had taught her, before he died, to read sign the plain way, not as a story a man wants to tell, but as a set of facts a landscape is trying to hand you, if you'll only stop talking long enough to receive them. Ruth had noticed things that spring that nobody had thought to ask a 13-year-old girl about. She noticed that the kills near town were smaller and messier than kills Ezra described from the ridge. Not the clean, single throat wound of a practiced solitary hunter, but multiple wounds, torn rather than opened, the carcasses dragged in ways that suggested something working in a pack, or something inexperienced, or both. She noticed tracks along the creek behind the Ferris place that were smaller than wolf tracks and closer set, with the claw marks showing plain, even, and firm ground, which her grandfather had once told her wolves rarely leave outside of snow or mud, because a wolf's claw sits higher and don't always print. She noticed, too, that whatever was doing the killing near town seemed bold in a way no seasoned wolf, ghost or otherwise, had any reason to be, moving through yards, past lantern light, close enough to houses that a truly wary animal would have kept its distance. She told her grandmother what she thought, that it wasn't one great wolf at all, but a family of coyotes, likely a mother teaching pups to hunt for the first time, driven bold and reckless by hunger and inexperience, both. Working the easy pickings at the edge of town because the deer and rabbit in the high country were still thin from a hard winter. Coyotes, her grandfather said, will follow the smell of a chicken coop over the truest wolf sign in creation, because a coyote is a practical creature first, and a fearsome one only by accident of the dark. The widow Calloway, being a sensible woman, walked Ruth over to Pruitt's store to say as much to whoever would listen. Nobody listened very hard. A wolf, and better yet, the legendary gray ghost, was a story with weight to it, a story that explained the fear people already felt and gave it a face worth dreading. A family of hungry coyotes, by comparison, sounded almost like an insult. Too small a thing to have thrown the whole town into such a state. Too ordinary an answer for people who had already decided, with Ezra's help, that only a monster could account for their losses. And Ezra Talbot, when the notion reached him second-hand, dismissed it within the length of a single breath. Coyotes don't kill full-grown cattle, he said. Coyotes don't den on Widow's Ridge. I know what took Cassius Reed 20 years to run down, and I know what it's like when I see its sign again. The girl means well, but she's reading rabbit tracks and calling them wolf. It did not occur to him that he might be doing the very same thing, in reverse, reading a legend into every ambiguous mark and calling it certainty. By the last week of April, the pattern Ruth had described was no longer a matter of guesswork. Something, several somethings, moving together, had grown bold enough to come into the heart of Millbrook Hollow itself. A dog was killed on the church steps one night, in full hearing of the parsonage. Its owner too frightened by the snarling and the sheer proximity of it to open his door until morning. 2 nights later, the Ordway family woke to a commotion in their barn and came out with lanterns to find their milk goat torn open in its stall. And worse by far, their smallest child, a boy named Daniel, who'd taken to sleeping in the hayloft on warm nights for the adventure of it, standing frozen at the loft's edge, with 3 low gray shapes circling in the straw below, drawn by the goat's blood, and not yet decided in their animal calculus whether the boy above them was prey or simply noise. It was Ruth Calloway, sleepless and restless with worry that had been building in her for weeks, who heard the goat's death bleat from her grandmother's porch 2 lots over, and came running with her grandfather's old lantern and her own good sense, shouting loud enough to scatter the shapes before they made up their minds. By the time the Ordways and half the street had gathered with rifles and torches, there was nothing left to shoot but 3 sets of prints in the barn dirt. Small, close set, claws showing plain, circling the hayloft ladder like something that had been thinking it over. Ezra Talbot was 30 miles east that night, camped on a game trail below Widow's Ridge, waiting with Judge for a ghost that had never once in 6 weeks of hunting actually crossed his path. He rode back into town at first light on a rumor and found it changed. Daniel Ordway sat wrapped in a quilt on his mother's lap, unhurt but hollow-eyed, while half the town stood arguing in the street about what had very nearly happened and whose fault it was that nobody had been watching the right direction. The widow Calloway stood at the center of it, one hand on Ruth's shoulder, saying with a calm that cut through the panic better than shouting could have, "My granddaughter told you what this was a month ago, and not one of you thought a girl's word was worth a grown hunter's story. Ezra dismounted slow, Judge whining low beside him, and for the first time in 6 weeks felt the ground of his own certainty give a little under his boots. He knelt where Ruth pointed at the tracks circling the Ordway barn and made himself look at them the way he had once, 20 years and a lifetime of pride ago. Learned to look at sign before he had a legend to protect. Small, close set, claws showing plain in dry dirt where a wolf's would not have. Multiple sets, moving together. The ragged, inexperienced work of animals that had not yet learned patience because they did not need it. Not with a town full of loose stock and careless barn doors and a hunter 30 miles off chasing a story he'd been telling himself since he was 23 years old. Coyotes, he said finally, and the word that cost him something to say out loud. Though nobody watching could have said exactly what. A family of them. Bold ones. That's what I told you, Ruth said, not unkindly, just plainly. The way her grandfather had taught her to say true things. Ezra looked at the girl, and then at Judge, who sat panting beside him with the particular unbothered dignity of a hound who's never once doubted his own nose, whatever tree he happened to be barking up at the time. And he understood, all at once with a clarity that shamed him more than any scolding could have, that he had spent 6 weeks doing exactly what he'd laughed at his own dog for doing 100 times before, baying with total conviction at the story he already knew, while the real danger, small and ordinary and entirely unglamorous, walked past, close enough to touch. I was so sure it had to be the ghost, he said, mostly to himself, that I never once asked what was actually leaving the tracks. The coyotes were dealt with inside a week, once the town knew what it was actually hunting, not with the reverent, half-frightened ceremony Ezra had brought to his ghost hunt, but with plain, coordinated sense. Barns shored up, stock penned closer to houses, watches kept at the hours Ruth had marked as the family's hunting time, and Ezra himself, humbled and quieter than the town had ever seen him, working alongside men half as experienced as he was because he had finally set down the story long enough to see the facts underneath it. He kept hunting after that spring, but he hunted differently. When sign turned up ambiguous, he made himself sit with the ambiguity a while before he named it. When a young rancher swore a mountain lion had taken his sheep, Ezra rode out and looked hard before he agreed. And more than once he found the truth to be smaller and stranger than the fear that had summoned him. A starving dog, a poor fence, a bear only passing through. He never did find out, in all his remaining years, whether the true gray ghost still moved somewhere in the high country above Widow's Ridge, or whether it had died of old age around the same winter Cassius Reed died of his blizzard-caught fever, and the legend had simply outlived the animal by 20 years, waiting for a man willing to keep it alive. But he came to understand something. He tried afterward to pass on to every young hunter who rode with him that the surest way to miss a danger is to already know its name before you've looked at its tracks. A man convinced of the shape of his enemy will find that shape in every broken twig and shadow and call it evidence, when it's only memory wearing evidence's clothes. The real threat rarely announces itself as the legend you were braced for. More often, it is smaller, closer, and far less interesting than the story, which is exactly why it gets past you. Ruth Calloway grew up to be, by all accounts, one of the finest trackers the Hollow had ever produced, and when people asked her how she'd known about the coyote so far ahead of a hunter 20 years her senior, she would only shrug and say what her grandfather had taught her. I didn't look for what I expected to find. I looked at what was actually there. And that, the old-timers of Millbrook Hollow used to say, was the whole lesson, worth more than every wolf story ever told around a stove in winter, that the tree a man barks up loudest is usually the one he chose before he ever saw the trail. And the danger that gets past him is the one that never matched the story he came looking for.